Welcome to the Mysterious History Town channel. Be sure to subscribe right now so you never miss videos like this one. Forget everything Hollywood ever taught you about the Old West. Forget the heroic cowboy riding into the sunset. Forget the noble sheriff cleaning up the town. Forget the romanticized frontier where brave white settlers tamed a wild and empty land. That version was not history. It was a product. A carefully packaged myth manufactured by dime novels, propaganda posters, and a film industry that needed a clean story to sell to a nation that could not face what had actually happened. The real Old West was not a stage set with dramatic duels at high noon. It was a machine of systematic violence, land theft, racial extermination, and industrial-scale exploitation dressed up in leather boots and cowboy hats. It was where the United States government perfected its methods of ethnic cleansing, where corporations used human lives as disposable equipment, where women were trafficked openly in broad daylight, and where men were hanged not for what they did, but for the color of their skin or the language they spoke. Today, you are going to learn 25 documented facts about the Old West that the history books buried, that Hollywood burned, and that the American mythology machine spent over 150 years trying to make you forget. These are not rumors. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented, verified, and recorded facts that historians have known about for decades while the public was fed a different story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so more people can find this video. Because after today, you will never look at a cowboy hat the same way again. Fact number 1. The Old West was not empty. It was deliberately emptied. Every Western movie begins with the same lie. A vast, open, untamed land, empty, waiting, ready for civilization to arrive and fill it with meaning. That land was not empty. It was home to over 600 distinct Native American nations, with populations that historians now estimate between 5 and 15 million people across North America before European contact. By 1890, that number had been reduced to fewer than 250,000. That is not a tragedy caused by misunderstanding. That is not an unfortunate side effect of progress. That is one of the largest demographic collapses in recorded human history, and it was largely deliberate. U.S. Army officers openly discussed the extermination of native populations in official correspondence. General William Sherman, the man celebrated in American history textbooks for his March to the Sea, wrote in 1867 that the more Native Americans killed that winter, the less work there would be to do in the spring. He did not write this in a private letter. He wrote it in an official military communication. It is in the National Archives. The history book chose a different page to show you. The Old West was not tamed. It was emptied by force, by disease deliberately spread through contaminated trade goods, by starvation caused by the destruction of the buffalo, and by military campaigns that targeted women and children as deliberately as they targeted warriors. The frontier was not a beginning. For millions of people, it was a meticulously organized ending. Fact number 2. The U.S. government used buffalo extermination as a biological weapon against Native Americans. By 1800, an estimated 30 to 60 million American bison roamed the Great Plains. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. This was not overhunting. This was not the natural consequence of westward expansion. This was a calculated, government-endorsed campaign to destroy the primary food source, spiritual foundation, and economic base of the Plains tribes. General Philip Sheridan, one of the most celebrated military figures of the post-Civil War era, stood before the Texas legislature in 1875 and told them that the buffalo hunters had done more to settle the Indian problem in the last 2 years than the entire regular army had done in the last 30. He proposed giving every hunter a bronze medal with a dead buffalo on one side and a discouraged-looking Indian on the other. The applause was loud and long. Professional hunters were paid to kill bison and leave the carcasses to rot. The hides were sold, the meat was left. The bones were ground into fertilizer. The Plains tribes watched their entire way of life collapse in less than 2 decades. Nations that had survived on the plains for thousands of years were reduced to starvation in a single generation. Children with distended stomachs begged at the edges of military forts for scraps of food. Elders died clutching medicine bundles that could no longer summon the herds that were no longer there. The gun did not win the West. Hunger did. Fact number 3. The Sand Creek Massacre was celebrated in the streets of Denver. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led 700 U.S. soldiers into a camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek, Colorado. The camp was flying an American flag and a white flag of peace. Chief Black Kettle had been explicitly told by U.S. authorities that his people were under the protection of the government. They had been instructed to camp at Sand Creek precisely because it was supposed to be safe. Chivington attacked at dawn. His orders, delivered to his troops the night before, were to kill and scalp all, big and little. The soldiers killed between 150 and 200 people. The majority were women, children, and elderly men. Soldiers cut off fingers to steal rings. They collected scalps and body parts as souvenirs. They mutilated pregnant women. They killed infants. An eyewitness account recorded soldiers using the severed body parts of women as decorations on their hats and saddle horns, which they then paraded through the streets of Denver to a cheering crowd. A congressional investigation later concluded that what Chivington carried out was a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were its victims. Chivington faced no criminal charges. He was never imprisoned. He never stood trial. He gave paid lectures about the battle for the rest of his life. His name is carved on memorials in Colorado to this day. The crowd that cheered him never apologized. History simply moved on to the next myth. Fact number 4. Chinese workers built the Transcontinental Railroad and were paid to die. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 is one of the most celebrated achievements in American history. The photographs from Promontory Summit in Utah show white men in top hats clinking champagne glasses and driving a golden spike. Not a single Chinese face appears in the photograph, despite the fact that the Central Pacific Railroad was built almost entirely by Chinese immigrant labor. Approximately 10,000 to 20,000 men who worked the most dangerous sections through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Chinese workers were paid between $26 and $35 per month, all while their white counterparts doing the same work earned $35 per month plus room and board. The Chinese workers provided their own food and shelter. When they went on strike in 1867 to demand equal pay, Charles Crocker, the railroad boss, responded not with negotiation, but by cutting off their food supply until they returned to work. They returned to work. They had no other choice. They were given the most lethal assignments. They were lowered in wicker baskets over cliff faces to drill holes for explosive charges, then pulled up before the blast. Sometimes the pulling was not fast enough. They worked through brutal Sierra Nevada winters in tunnels dug beneath 40 feet of snow. Entire work camps were buried in avalanches and were not recovered until the spring thaw. The exact death toll has never been officially recorded because the railroad companies did not consider it necessary to keep count. Estimates range from 1,000 to 10,000 Chinese workers who died building a railroad they were then forbidden by law to ride in the same cars as white passengers. The golden spike was driven by men who never touched it. Fact number 5. The Homestead Act was the largest land theft in American history. The Homestead Act of 1862 is taught in American schools as one of the great democratic achievements of the Lincoln administration. The federal government gave away 160 acres of free land to any citizen willing to farm it for 5 years. It sounds generous. It sounds fair. It was neither. That land was not federal land to give away. It belonged to the Native American nations who had lived on it, farmed it, hunted it, and held it as sacred for thousands of years. The Homestead Act did not create opportunity. It legalized and industrialized the theft of an entire continent. Between 1862 and 1900, the government distributed approximately 80 million acres of native land to white settlers under the Act. The tribes who had been forcibly removed from these lands were given no compensation, no legal recourse, and no acknowledgement that anything had been taken from them. George Crook, one of the Army generals most involved in Native American campaigns, wrote privately in his memoirs that the treatment of Native Americans was the darkest stain on the history of the United States. And he wrote this while personally overseeing campaigns of removal and destruction. The system knew what it was doing and did it anyway. The paperwork was filed, the land was transferred, the people who had lived there were reclassified as obstacles and removed accordingly. Real estate transactions do not require a conscience. Fact number 6. Frontier doctors. Amputated limbs without anesthesia as standard practice. The image of Old West medicine is a gruff but capable doctor with a leather bag and a bottle of whiskey. The reality was a man with a bone saw, no formal training, no sterile instruments, and a leather strap for the patient to bite down on while screaming. Anesthesia existed by the mid-1800s, but on the frontier it was rarely available, rarely affordable, and frequently not used even when it could have been. And field surgeons during the Indian Wars performed amputations in open tents while battles were still ongoing around them. The speed of the amputation was considered a mark of skill. Some surgeons could remove a limb in under 60 seconds. What they could not remove was the infection that followed. Gangrene killed more soldiers and settlers in the West than bullets did. Men who survived the initial wound frequently died weeks later in agonizing stages of tissue rot, fever, and organ failure. Frontier dentistry was its own specific category of horror. Teeth were extracted with pliers and no anesthesia. Abscessed teeth frequently became fatal infections. An infected tooth that traveled to the jaw could kill a man in days. Laudanum and whiskey were the primary pain management options on the frontier. Both were addictive, both were cheap, both were widely distributed. The man who rode into town looking for a gunfight was frequently already in chronic pain, a half-drunk on opium tincture and running a low-grade fever. The Old West was not heroic. It was a place where the human body broke down faster than it could be repaired. Fact number 7. Women were trafficked openly along established trade routes in the Old West. The saloon girl in the movies wears a feathered dress and dances with a smile. She exists by choice, by freedom, by the spirit of frontier independence. The historical reality is that the overwhelming majority of women working in frontier brothels and saloons were not there by choice. They were there because they had been trafficked, coerced, or had been left with no survivable alternative. Chinese women were brought to California and the American West under false promises of employment and marriage, then sold to brothels upon arrival. Historical records from San Francisco show women being sold at auction openly in the 1850s and 1860s for prices ranging from $40 to $1,000, depending on their age and perceived desirability. The Tong organizations that controlled this trade were documented by city authorities, investigated by committees, and left entirely alone because the economy of the frontier boomtown depended on their services. That young women from the eastern states were recruited with advertisements in newspapers promising respectable employment as waitresses, cooks, and seamstresses in the booming western towns. The jobs did not exist. The women arrived to find their transportation debts so large that they could not legally leave until they had worked them off. Some never left at all. They died of tuberculosis, violence, opium addiction, or the cumulative physical destruction of years of forced labor. A woman in a frontier brothel had an average life expectancy of 35 years. The smile in the movies was not in the historical record. Only the ledger entries survived, and those recorded her as an asset, not a human being. Fact number 8. More people were lynched in the West than in any gunfight. The mythology of the Old West is built on the gunfight. 2 men, 1 street, 1 draw. Clean violence with clear rules. The reality of Western violence was far less dramatic and far more cowardly. The most common form of killing in the frontier West was not the duel. It was the lynching, mob justice. A rope thrown over a tree branch by a group of men who had already decided the verdict before the trial that never happened. Between 1850 and 1900, an estimated 400 to 600 people were lynched in California alone. The targets were disproportionately Mexican, Chinese, Native American, and black men, though white men accused of cattle rustling or claim jumping were not immune. The legal system in most frontier territories was either non-existent or so corrupt that mob violence became the de facto standard of justice. County sheriffs frequently led the lynch mobs themselves or stood aside while their deputies participated. Josefa Segovia was hanged by a mob in Downeyville, California in 1851, making her the only woman lynched in California gold rush history. She had stabbed a white miner who had broken into her home and assaulted her. The miner had come to her door the previous night drunk and destroyed her property. When he came back the next morning, she defended herself with a knife. She was arrested, tried by a mob assembled in the street, convicted in minutes, and hanged from the bridge over the Yuba River the same afternoon. Her defense lawyer was shouted down by the crowd before he could finish speaking. The man she killed had no record of the assault investigated. Justice in the frontier West did not wear a blindfold. It wore a mask. Fact number 9. Wyatt Earp was not a hero. He was a pimp, a fixer, and a professional mythmaker. Wyatt Earp is one of the most celebrated figures in American frontier mythology. Lawman, hero, the man who cleaned up the West. The reality documented in historical records, court documents, and contemporary newspaper accounts tells a very different story. Earp worked in multiple frontier towns, not primarily as a lawman, but as a saloon operator, a gambler, and in several documented instances as a manager of prostitution operations. In Wichita, Kansas, Earp was removed from the city police force in 1876 after being charged with stealing campaign funds. In Tombstone, Arizona, the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881 was not a heroic confrontation between law and order. It was a street brawl between competing criminal factions over control of the town's gambling and vice operations. 3 men died in 30 seconds. The Earps were subsequently charged with murder. The charges were eventually dropped, but the historical record does not support the version sold to Hollywood. The myth of Wyatt Earp as the heroic lawman was largely constructed by Earp himself. In the 1920s, as a very old man living in Los Angeles, he befriended a writer named Stuart Lake and dictated his memoirs. The book was published in 1931, 2 years after Earp's death, under the title Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. It was almost entirely fiction. It became the foundation for dozens of films, television shows, and the entire mythology of the noble Western lawman. Earp understood something essential. If you live long enough and talk to the right writer, you can become whatever version of yourself you choose. History is the story told by the survivor with the best publicist. Fact number 10. The Trail of Tears did not end when the history books say it did. The forced removal of the 5 civilized tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Between 1830 and 1850 is one of the most documented atrocities in American history. Approximately 60,000 to 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly marched at gunpoint. Estimates of deaths range from 10,000 to 25,000. The Cherokee alone lost between 25% and 50% of their population during the removal. Oh, but the Trail of Tears was not a single event with a clear beginning and end. It was a template. The same forced removal process was applied to tribe after tribe across the entire continent for the rest of the 19th century. the Navajo Long Walk of 1864, the Nez Perce Surrender of 1877, the Apache deportation of the 1880s. Each removal followed the same structure. Treaty negotiated under duress. Land taken, people marched, resistance crushed. A survivors deposited on land so poor that survival itself became a form of ongoing punishment. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce led his people in a 1,170-mile flight toward Canada in 1877, pursued by the U.S. Army across 4 states and several mountain ranges. His people, including women, children, and elderly, outmaneuvered military units for nearly 4 months. They were finally captured just 40 miles from the Canadian border. Chief Joseph's surrender speech contained the words, "Out from where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Those words are remembered as noble and poetic. What is less remembered is that after surrendering with a promise of safe return to his homeland, Chief Joseph was sent to Indian Territory in Kansas, where a significant portion of his already devastated people died of disease within the first year. The government broke the promise before he had finished speaking it. Fact number 11. The real cowboys were mostly black and Mexican, not white. The cowboy of American mythology is white, rugged, independent, and Anglo-Saxon. The historical cowboy was demographically something very different. Historians estimate that between 25% and 35% of all cowboys working the cattle drives of the post-Civil War West were black men, most of them formerly enslaved people who had learned cattle skills on southern plantations. Another 20% to 25% were Mexican vaqueros, the men who had invented almost every technique, tool, and skill that defined the cowboy trade long before Anglo settlers arrived in Texas. The word cowboy itself comes from vaquero, the Spanish term for cattle herder. The lasso, the saddle design, the cattle drive formation, the branding techniques, all of it was developed by Mexican vaqueros and adopted wholesale by Anglo ranchers who then proceeded to erase the source from the mythology. Black cowboys like Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, and Bill Pickett, who invented steer wrestling, were among the most skilled and celebrated cowboys of the era in their own time. Their names are almost entirely absent from the Hollywood version of the story. On the cattle drives, the work was brutal regardless of color. Cowboys spent months on the trail, sleeping on the ground, eating hardtack and dried beef, working 16 to 18-hour days in weather that ranged from blinding blizzards to 110-degree Texas heat. The average cowboy earned between $25 and $40 per month. The cattle barons who owned the herds they were driving earned fortunes. The gap between the man on the horse and the man who owned the horse was the same gap that has always existed between labor and capital. The hat was just a more photogenic detail. Fact number 12. Children as young as 6 worked in Western mines in conditions that killed adults. The gold rush and silver boom of the American West are taught as stories of opportunity and democratic adventure. Any man with a pick and a dream could strike it rich. The reality of Western mining was a world of corporate monopoly, child labor, and industrial mortality rates that would qualify as war crimes if they happened today. In the hard rock mines of Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona, children as young as 6 and 7 were employed as trappers, boys who sat alone in total darkness underground for 12 to 14 hours a day, operating ventilation doors for coal and ore carts. They were paid pennies. They worked 6 days a week. They frequently fell asleep from exhaustion and were crushed by the carts passing through the doors they were supposed to open. The mine companies recorded these deaths as accidents and deducted the cost of any damages from the family's account. Slightly older boys worked as breaker boys, crouching over conveyor belts of freshly mined coal for 10 to 12 hours a day, separating slate from coal with bare hands while breathing coal dust that guaranteed black lung disease before the age of 30. Their fingers were perpetually cut and bleeding. Supervisors walked behind them with sticks to keep them from slowing down. A boy who worked the mines from age 7 to age 30, if he survived that long, would be old before his 40th birthday, coughing blood in a company-owned house for which his wages were being garnished. The gold rush made millionaires. It made far more orphans. Fact number 13. Entire towns were built on stolen Mexican land after a deliberately started war. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 is described in American history books as a border dispute that escalated into conflict. The more accurate description, given by Ulysses S. Grant himself, who fought in the war as a young officer, was that it was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. Grant wrote this in his personal memoirs, and he was not exaggerating. President James K. Polk sent American troops into disputed territory specifically to provoke a Mexican military response that could be used as justification for a war he had already decided to start. When the Mexican forces responded as expected, Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil, which was a deliberate lie since the territory in question was disputed at best and Mexican at minimum. Congressman Abraham Lincoln, then serving his only term in the House of Representatives, stood on the floor of Congress and demanded that Polk identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed and prove it was on American soil. Lincoln received no satisfactory answer. The war proceeded anyway. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 forced Mexico to cede 525,000 square miles of territory, present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma, for $15 million, which was roughly what Polk had offered to buy the territory for before the war. Mexico did not sell. Polk took it with guns and called it a purchase. Mexican families who had lived on that land for generations became foreigners on their own property overnight. Their land titles were challenged in American courts, where proceedings were conducted in English with no translation provided and stripped away systematically over the following decades. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Tucson, Albuquerque, the grand cities of the American West were built on the legal architecture of a deliberately engineered theft. Fact number 14. The Chinese Exclusion Act was preceded by documented mass murder. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first and only U.S. law to ban a specific ethnic group from immigration based solely on race. History books present it as a legislative action with economic motivations. What preceded it was a wave of organized massacres that the federal government declined to prosecute and that local governments actively participated in. The Rock Springs Massacre of 1885 in Wyoming Territory was among the worst. White miners, furious at the employment of Chinese workers by the Union Pacific Railroad, attacked the Chinese section of the mining camp on September 2nd. They killed at least 28 Chinese workers, wounded 15 more, and drove 75 to 80 others into the surrounding desert, where several more died of exposure, and burned every Chinese-owned structure in the camp to the ground. The attackers were arrested. A grand jury refused to indict any of them. The official explanation was that the violence was the natural result of racial incompatibility. Congress agreed with this assessment and sent the Chinese community $150,000 in compensation, not for justice, but to pacify diplomatic complaints from China. No one was ever charged. The Los Angeles Massacre of 1871 occurred when a white mob of approximately 500 people attacked the Chinese quarter of the city, killing 18 Chinese residents, roughly 10% of Los Angeles's entire Chinese population at the time. The victims were shot, stabbed, and hanged from lampposts. 17 men were eventually convicted of manslaughter. All convictions were overturned on a legal technicality within a year. And the United States government spent more diplomatic energy apologizing to the Chinese government for the embarrassment than it ever spent protecting Chinese residents from the violence. Immigration restrictions are easier to enforce than justice. Fact number 15. Frontier judges hanged innocent men as a warning to others. Hanging Judge Isaac Parker presided over the federal court for the Western District of Arkansas from 1875 to 1896. In those 21 years, he sentenced 160 people to death and 79 were actually executed, earning him the most executions of any judge in American history. Parker is celebrated in Western mythology as a tough but fair dispenser of frontier justice. The record tells a more complicated story. Parker ran a one-man judicial system with no appeal process for the first 14 years of his tenure. His courtroom had no functioning right to appeal until Congress established one in 1889. Until that point, his word was final. And he openly stated in public that the purpose of execution was deterrence, not justice. He believed that the spectacle of public hanging was a tool of social control, and that the specific guilt of the individual being hanged was secondary to the message the execution sent to others. He was not hiding this view. He stated it plainly. Of the men Parker sentenced to death, documented post-conviction investigations have cast serious doubt on the guilt of several. At least a handful were convicted on the testimony of single witnesses with documented personal motives to lie, with no physical evidence, and with defense attorneys who were paid nothing and spent little time on the cases. The frontier legal system was not a search for truth. It was a performance of authority. The gallows was the stage. The condemned man was the prop. And the crowd that came to watch the hanging on a Saturday morning came for the same reason crowds always come to public executions, not for justice, but for the reassurance that the power structure was still functioning and still visible. Fact number 16. The ghost dance was a prayer for peace that the U.S. Army responded to with massacre. In 1889 and 1890, a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance spread rapidly through the devastated Native American nations of the Great Plains. It was started by a Paiute prophet named Wovoka, who preached a message of non-violence, clean living, and faith. He taught that if the people danced the ghost dance, the land would be renewed, the buffalo would return, the dead would come back, and the white settlers would be swept away by a great flood of earth. It was, in its essence, a prayer. A desperate, beautiful prayer from a people who had lost almost everything. The U.S. Army looked at thousands of grieving, while starving people dancing in circles, and saw a military threat. Indian agents sent panicked telegrams to Washington describing the movement as hostile and dangerous. The Army mobilized. They attempted to arrest Sitting Bull, the most famous Lakota leader, at his cabin on the Standing Rock Reservation on December 15, 1890. In the confrontation that followed, Sitting Bull was shot and killed by Native American police working for the U.S. government. He was 59 years old, 2 weeks later. On December 29, 1890, U.S. Army soldiers confronted a band of Lakota people led by Chief Bigfoot at a place called Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. What happened next took approximately 1 hour. When it was over, between 250 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children lay dead in the snow. Many were found miles from the camp, shot in the back while trying to run. The soldiers who carried out the massacre received the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, for their actions that day. 20 of those medals have never been revoked. They still stand on the record as acts of valor. A prayer answered with a rifle is not suppression. It is terror with paperwork. Fact number 17. Reservations were designed to kill through starvation, not contain through geography. The reservation system is taught as a compromise solution, a way of preserving Native American peoples and cultures while opening the rest of the land to American settlement. The documented record of how reservations were administered tells a very different story. The reservations were selected for land that was, in most cases, agriculturally useless. The soil was poor. Water was scarce. Game had already been exterminated from the surrounding region. And the rations promised in treaties were delivered late, delivered short, or delivered in a state of decomposition so advanced that eating them caused disease. Government contractors who supplied reservation rations were paid based on the amount they delivered, not the quality. Barrels of beef arrived rotten. Flour was cut with chalk. Blankets sent to reservations during winter months were documented as threadbare and inadequate. The agents who oversaw the distribution frequently sold the surplus rations on the open market and pocketed the difference. Congressional investigators documented this fraud repeatedly between 1870 and 1900. The fraud continued anyway because the political will to stop it did not exist. Nobody who mattered suffered when a Lakota child starved on a South Dakota reservation in February. Helen Hunt Jackson published her landmark book A Century of Dishonor in 1881, documenting the U.S. on government's systematic violation of every single treaty it had signed with Native nations. She personally delivered a copy to every member of Congress. The book caused a brief public controversy and was subsequently ignored by the government entirely. The treaties continued to be broken. The rations continued to be stolen. The people continued to die in documented, quantifiable, preventable numbers that no one with the power to stop it ever stopped. Some records are more comfortable unread. Fact number 18. Opium was legally sold in every frontier town. Pharmacy and created mass addiction. The Old West had a drug epidemic. It had several. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold over the counter in every frontier pharmacy with no prescription required, no warnings attached, and no legal restrictions whatsoever. It was marketed specifically to women for menstrual pain, anxiety, headaches, and what physicians of the era called female nervousness. Patent medicines with names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, marketed for teething infants, contained morphine in measurable doses. Sears, Roebuck, sold cocaine toothache drops by mail order. In frontier mining towns, opium dens operated openly alongside saloons and brothels. Chinese immigrants who had established the dens were subsequently blamed for introducing the addiction to white American communities, which led to some of the earliest racial drug legislation, not because opium was suddenly more dangerous, but because white Americans were now the ones consuming it, and someone needed to be blamed for that fact. The drug problem was the same drug problem. The criminalization depended entirely on who was being seen using it. The addicted frontier West is not a story told in movies. The trembling hand of the laudanum-dependent frontier wife, the morphine-addicted Civil War veteran homesteading in Kansas, the child given opium syrup to stop crying in a sod house on the plains. These people filled the West as surely as any gunslinger ever did. Their stories were not dramatic enough for the dime novels. They died quietly, in beds, not in gunfights, and so history forgot them, which is perhaps the least merciful thing history could have done. Fact number 19. Wild West shows were exploitation operations that imprisoned Native Americans. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which toured the United States and Europe from 1883 to 1913, is remembered as a colorful entertainment spectacle and a piece of cultural Americana. What it actually was, documented in the contracts and correspondence of the era, was an exploitation operation that used Native American performers under conditions that a modern court would likely classify as indentured servitude. Sitting Bull traveled with the show for one season in 1885, reportedly earning $50 per week. His primary function was to be pointed at by audiences and booed. He reportedly gave most of his money away to the street children he encountered in eastern cities, a practice that mystified his employers. And he returned to the reservation after one season and refused to go back, saying that he preferred the company of his own people to the company of men who cheated and lied. He was murdered 5 years later by government police. The show went on without him. Native American performers in the Wild West shows were frequently trapped in touring contracts with no clear end date, no provision for return transportation if they became ill, and no legal recourse when the show managers changed the payment terms mid-tour. Several died in Europe and were buried there far from their homelands and families. The show presented them as savage enemies of civilization who had been rightfully conquered by white heroism. They performed their own subjugation 8 times a week, 6 months a year, for an audience that applauded the historical reality that had destroyed their nations. Performance can be a very specific kind of humiliation. Fact number 20. The gunfighter myth was almost entirely invented by newspaper editors. The concept of the quick-draw gunfighter who settled disputes with formal duels at high noon was not a reality of the Old West. It was a journalistic invention that sold papers in eastern cities whose readers wanted the West to be exciting. Contemporary newspaper accounts and court records from the most famous Western towns, Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood, revealed that the actual rate of gunfight deaths was remarkably low compared to the mythological reputation. Dodge City, in its most violent year on record, recorded a total of 5 homicides. The same year, New York City recorded hundreds. The men celebrated as gunfighters in the dime novels and later films were, in documented reality, a mixed collection of gamblers, confidence men, sometime lawmen, and professional criminals. Wild Bill Hickok, celebrated as perhaps the greatest gunfighter of the era, was shot in the back of the head while playing poker. He was holding aces and eights, which became known as the dead man's hand. He did not go out in a blaze of glory in a street duel. He was murdered from behind by a man named Jack McCall, who later claimed he shot Hickok in revenge for a previous killing. McCall was acquitted in a minor's court, then arrested again when it was pointed out that the first acquittal had no legal standing. Retried in a federal court, convicted, and hanged. Even the death of the most famous gunfighter in the West was a legal and narrative mess that bore no resemblance to the story later told about it. The myth required a clean story: courage, skill, justice, consequence. The reality required a coroner's report, 2 trials, and a hanging that nobody filmed. Legend always photographs better than the truth. Fact number 21. The Pony Express lasted 18 months and went bankrupt while destroying its riders. The Pony Express is one of the most romanticized institutions of the Old West, a relay mail system using young riders on fast horses to carry mail from Missouri to California in approximately 10 days. The reality of the Pony Express was an 18-month financial disaster that went bankrupt almost immediately after the transcontinental telegraph made it obsolete, and that recruited its riders with advertisements that were, in practical effect, death warrants. The job advertisement for Pony Express riders famously specified, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred." The orphans preferred line has been debated by historians as possibly apocryphal, but the rest of the requirements were real. Riders were paid approximately $100 to $150 per month, which was good wages for the time, in exchange for riding alone through 75 to 100 miles of terrain that included the Sierra Nevada mountains, the Great Basin Desert, and the heart of Paiute and Sioux territory, in weather that ranged from summer desert temperatures above 110 degrees to winter mountain conditions that could kill a man in hours. The total life of the Pony Express was 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861. It carried approximately 35,000 letters. The Western Union Telegraph, which rendered it immediately obsolete, was completed 2 days before the Pony Express officially suspended service. The company lost approximately $200,000 over its entire operation, an enormous sum for the era. The investors lost their money. The riders, who had risked their lives daily for a year and a half, received their last wages and were dismissed with no pension, no acknowledgement, and no ceremony. The legend survived. The riders were on their own. Some legacies are more profitable for the people who tell them than the people who live them. Fact number 22. Frontier prisons were torture facilities with industry attached. The territorial prisons of the American West are marketed today as tourist attractions. Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona charges admission, and sells branded merchandise. The cells that confined men in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit in Arizona summers are now described in the Visitor's Guide as historically significant. The men who died in those cells of heat stroke, scurvy, and untreated infections are not mentioned in the branding materials. Convict leasing, the system by which state governments rented prisoners to private companies as labor, existed across the West as thoroughly as it did in the South. Prisoners in Western territories built roads, mined ore, laid railroad track, and cleared land for agricultural development, all at no wage, under guard. In conditions that generated mortality rates, the contracting companies simply absorbed as a cost of doing business. The territorial governments received a per-head leasing fee that went into general revenue. The private companies received free labor, and the prisoners received nothing except the opportunity to work until they either completed their sentence, escaped, or died. The crimes that sent men to these facilities ranged from murder to public intoxication, from claim jumping to being in the wrong town at the wrong time with the wrong skin color. Vagrancy laws were enforced selectively and aggressively against Black, Mexican, and Chinese visa men, ensuring a steady supply of free labor for the companies that had lobbied the territorial legislatures to pass the vagrancy statutes in the first place. The prison was not a consequence of the crime. The crime was manufactured to justify the prison that was required to supply the labor. The sequence matters. The profit always came first. The law was written afterward to legitimize it. Fact number 23. The water wars of the West killed more people than all its famous gunfights combined. The most violent conflicts in the American West were not between outlaws and marshals. They were over water. In an arid landscape where the difference between a creek and a dry gulch was the difference between survival and ruin, water rights were more valuable than gold. And men killed each other for them with far less hesitation and far more frequency than any romantic mythology ever acknowledged. The Lincoln County War in New Mexico in 1878, in which Billy the Kid is the most famous participant, was at its core a conflict between competing commercial interests over contracts, water access, and market control in a drought-prone territory. The Pleasant Valley War in Arizona between 1882 and 1892 killed over 30 people and effectively wiped out two entire extended families, the Grahams and the Tewksburys. The original dispute was over cattle grazing rights in a valley with limited water. It ended only because there were too few people left on either side to continue fighting. William Mulholland, the man who engineered the Los Angeles Aqueduct in 1913, an engineering project celebrated as a triumph of civilization, secretly bought up land in the Owens Valley of California through government intermediaries before the aqueduct project was publicly announced, ensuring massive profits for insiders while draining the Owens Valley dry and turning it from productive agricultural land into dust. When the Owens Valley farmers discovered what had been done to them, they dynamited the aqueduct repeatedly between 1924 and 1927 in a campaign of sabotage that the Los Angeles newspapers described as terrorism. The farmers described it as the only tool left to people whose land and water had been stolen by men who owned the government and the newspapers simultaneously. They were not wrong. They lost anyway. Fact number 24. African American soldiers called Buffalo Soldiers were used to dispossess the very people who shared their history of oppression. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army created 4 new regiments composed entirely of black soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Native Americans called them Buffalo Soldiers, reportedly because their hair resembled the thick curly coat of a buffalo. The soldiers took the name as a mark of respect and honor. The history of what they were deployed to do is considerably more complex than the honor. The Buffalo Soldiers were assigned to the frontier specifically to enforce U.S. government policy against Native American nations. They fought in the Apache Wars, the Red River War, and the campaigns that resulted in the final confinement of the Plains tribes to reservations. They were black men who had been enslaved or descended from the enslaved, either fighting on behalf of the government that had enslaved them to dispossess indigenous people from their land on behalf of the same economic system that had enslaved black people. The irony was not lost on everyone at the time. Some Buffalo soldiers deserted and joined Apache or Comanche bands. The Army classified them as renegades. A black soldier named Sergeant John Ward received the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Apache campaigns. And his photograph shows a man in uniform looking directly at the camera with an expression that tells you nothing and everything simultaneously. The system used every available tool. It recycled the oppressed as the instrument of oppression and called the result progress. The Buffalo Soldiers served with documented courage and professionalism in the field. What they were being asked to do with that courage and professionalism was the question that the medals were designed to prevent anyone from asking. Fact number 25. The Old West never ended. It just changed its name. In 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner stood before the American Historical Association and announced that the frontier was closed. The Census Bureau had declared that no continuous frontier line existed anymore. The West had been won. Turner argued that the frontier had been the defining force of American democracy and national character. With its closing, he suggested something fundamental about America had ended. He was wrong about the ending. He was wrong about what the frontier had actually been. The mechanisms of the Old West, the legal theft of land, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the criminalization of poverty, the mythology that covered the violence with romance, those mechanisms did not end in 1890. They moved indoors. They changed their paperwork. They hired lawyers instead of gunfighters and called the result civilization. The Native American reservations, established in the 19th century, remain among the most economically deprived communities in the United States. The Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, home of the Oglala Lakota people, has an unemployment rate that has historically ranged between 80% and 90%. Life expectancy there is comparable to some of the poorest nations on earth. The land was taken, the people were left on what remained. The consequences were documented, predicted, and produced deliberately, and they continue. The prison system that replaced convict leasing incarcerates Native Americans at a rate 5 times higher than white Americans. It incarcerates black Americans at a rate more than 5 times the national average. The water that was stolen from the Owens Valley still flows into Los Angeles through a pipeline that was dynamited and repaired and eventually simply accepted, the way that all sufficiently old theft eventually becomes accepted as the natural order of things. The cowboy became the corporate executive. The claim jumper became the real estate developer. The frontier judge who hanged men to send a message became the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that send messages to entire zip codes. The West was not won, it was organized, and the organization never stopped. It simply became too large and too bureaucratic to see as a single connected system, which was the point all along. When you make the violence invisible, you do not end the violence. You just stop having to look at it. The Old West was not a chapter in American history. It was a blueprint, every mechanism of exploitation, extraction, and mythology building that defined the frontier of the 19th century can be traced forward in an unbroken line to institutions, policies, and power structures that exist today. The land that was taken is still taken. The labor that was stolen is still being compensated at rates designed to prevent accumulation of wealth. The mythology that was manufactured to justify all of it is still being broadcast, still being marketed, still being sold with better production values and a bigger budget. These are not comfortable facts. They were not meant to be comfortable. Comfort was for the dime novels. The documents were always in the archives, waiting for someone willing to read them without flinching. If this video told you something your history class never did, subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who still believes the cowboy rode off into a clean sunset. Because the truth is that when the cowboy rode off, He was riding toward something, not away from it. And understanding what he was riding toward is the only way to understand the world that was built when he arrived. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments below. What disturbed you most? Let us know.